Out here in the quiet corners of America, the things that scare us most don't always come from shadows or superstition. Sometimes they're the stories whispered by campers, travelers, neighbors just like you. Welcome to Neighbors Recounted, where real people relive the nights they still can't forget. And after you hear today's story, if something in it reminds you of a moment you've tried to shake off, a sound you once heard in the dark, or a night you still can't explain, tell us. Share it in the comments. Your experience might be the next story we bring to life. Now, settle in, because the night one RV camper heard footsteps circling his rig at 2 a.m. was only the beginning. I've always believed that silence has a weight to it, but I never understood how heavy it could truly feel until the night it pressed against the thin aluminum walls of my RV, tight, suffocating, and alive with something that seemed to breathe just beyond the reach of the porch light. That was the night I realized there are sounds in the wilderness that don't belong to anything you can name. And once you hear them, once they hear you, your sense of safety never returns in quite the same shape. My name is Evan Holt. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person who camps to think, not to socialize. Zion National Park had always been a place I retreated to when life felt too loud, too confusing, too much. Something about those towering sandstone cliffs made my own problems seem small. And in May of 2023, I needed that more than ever. I had just left a job that had become unbearable. Long hours, no direction, a constant feeling that I was building something that didn't matter. Walking away from it gave me relief, but also an emptiness I didn't know what to do with. So I packed up my old Volkswagen engine-converted RV, a boxy white 1991 Carter conversion I'd renovated by hand, and drove south until the world became red rock and sky. I checked into South Campground on a Thursday afternoon. Zion was already warming up, the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders and tells you it's going to be a long summer. My spot was tucked beneath cottonwoods, close enough to the Virgin River that I could hear water moving gently over stones. There were families around, mostly quiet, and a few solo campers who nodded politely but kept to themselves. It felt like the right place to be alone without being isolated, at least during the day. There's something about that campground at night that's hard to explain unless you've stayed there. How the cliffs absorb the daylight and then give nothing back after sunset. Everything becomes still, too still, like the landscape itself is listening. And when the moon hides behind the canyon walls, the darkness comes down fast, absolute, and old. That first evening, I sat outside with only the RV porch light glowing faintly against the gravel. I remember the air cooling in slow waves, the smell of cottonwoods mixing with distant campfire smoke. I remember watching the shadows stretch longer than they should have. I remember telling myself it was just the canyon playing tricks on my tired mind. But the truth is, the unease had started long before the footsteps. I noticed it when I walked to the restroom around 10 p.m. The campground road was empty, too empty. I didn't see a single person out, even though lights were still on in a few RVs and tents. The breeze had died completely, leaving the leaves hanging motionless. And everywhere I walked, I had this strange sense that the darkness wasn't passive, that it was aware of me, as if every crunch of gravel under my sandals echoed louder than it should have, bouncing between the cliffs, returning to me distorted. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone pacing behind me, but there was never anything there. Just the long, narrow road lit by dim yellow park lamps spaced too far apart. When I got back, I locked the RV door, a habit I rarely bothered with at campgrounds. I settled onto the small bed, cracked a window for air, and listened to the sounds of the river. For a while, that helped. The gentle moving water, the occasional car passing on the distant road, it was familiar, grounding. But around midnight, everything went quiet again. The river faded into background murmur, and the campground seemed to fall into a kind of unnatural stillness. No footsteps, no zippers, no laughter from late-night campers, not even the soft rustling of sleeping bags or someone shifting on an air mattress. Just silence, thick and pressing. I tried to sleep. I turned onto my side, stared at the tiny sliver of moonlight coming through the blinds, and eventually, exhaustion won. But I woke up to the unmistakable sound of gravel shifting under weight. At first, it was faint, a slow, deliberate crunch, like someone testing their footing or taking a single step. I held my breath and listened hard. Another step, then another. They weren't wandering steps. They weren't random. They were approaching the RV, coming from the direction of the road. Slow, unhurried, almost curious. My first thought was that it had to be a late-arriving camper finding their site. That happens sometimes. People get lost or show up in the dark. But this wasn't the sound of someone trying to find anything. The footsteps were too steady, too direct, too purposeful. They were heading straight toward me. I glanced at my phone, 2:04 a.m. Great, I thought. Maybe a ranger, but something in me knew better. There was no flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, no clipped radio chatter. Rangers don't typically walk silently through campsites in the dead of night, unannounced. And even if they did, they wouldn't creep like that, one slow step at a time, pausing between each one. I slid off the bed silently and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. Just the faint glow of the nearest lamp and the pitch black between. The footsteps kept coming. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. They stopped right outside the RV door. The hairs on my arms lifted. My chest tightened. I felt my heartbeat thudding in my throat, too loud, like it might give me away. Then came the sound that still makes my skin tighten when I think about it. A long, slow exhale, right outside the window, so close it fogged the glass. I stumbled backward without meaning to, knocking into the small kitchenette counter. Panic surged through me, raw, electric, instinctual. I reached for the nearest thing that could be used as a weapon. A cast iron skillet I'd left on the stove. My hands trembled as I gripped it. Another exhale, this one softer, almost disappointed. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong, profoundly wrong. I forced myself to look through the blinds again, but all I saw was darkness, no face, no figure, nothing. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they moved around the RV, slowly circling it, once, twice, 3 times. Each loop came a little closer. Each step dragged slightly now, as though the person or whatever it was tired or savoring the moment. I whispered to myself, why isn't anyone else hearing this? Why isn't anyone coming out? But the campground remained eerily silent, as if the whole place were holding its breath. On the 4th pass, the footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. A faint shadow fell across the blinds, subtle but noticeable. Someone was standing there, listening, waiting. My palms were slick with sweat. My throat felt tight. I tried to think rationally, but my thoughts spun out in 100 directions. Should I call 911? Should I turn on all the lights? Should I shout? Should I stay silent? As I stood frozen, the shadow shifted slowly, leaning closer. And then I heard it. Not breathing, not footsteps, but a whisper. A voice so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. It said my name, Evan, except I had told no one my name at that campground. And the voice wasn't familiar, not even remotely. That was the moment the fear stopped being unease and became something primal, something that made my vision shimmer and my knees weaken. I didn't even realize I dropped the skillet until it hit the floor. And when it did, the shadow outside the window moved. It didn't run, it didn't jump, it didn't even flinch. It simply straightened, as though now it knew exactly where I was standing, and it began to reach toward the window. The movement was slow, deliberate, patient, like someone raising a hand to tap on glass, and just before the fingers touched the window pane, the campground lights flickered. Once, twice, then everything went dark. When the lights snapped out, the darkness rushed in so completely that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The canyon swallowed every outline, every familiar shape, leaving only the faintest glow from the sky leaking around the blinds. For a few suspended seconds, I couldn't tell if the shadow at the window was still there. I couldn't even tell where the walls were. It felt like the RV had been dropped into black water. But then came the sound. Not footsteps this time. fingertips slowly dragging across the metal siding, a soft scraping arc like someone was tracing the contour of the RV with a single finger. Not scratching, not banging, just touching, as if mapping its shape by feel. I staggered backward until my shoulder hit the opposite wall. The skillet lay somewhere near my feet, useless now. My phone sat on the counter, but the screen was dim, probably in sleep mode. And I knew if I reached for it, the sound of my footsteps on the laminate floor would give away my exact position. The dragging stopped. Silence expanded in the dark like a living thing. Then, tap. A single, decisive knock on the window. Not loud, not aggressive, but intentional. Another. Tap. Then a third. Tap. 3 beats spaced perfectly apart as if following a rhythm only the visitor understood. Something inside me broke then, the thin barrier between fear and something far more dangerous, the urge to act without thinking. I lunged toward the counter, grabbed my phone, and swiped blindly at the screen. The moment my thumb brushed the glass, the window shook. Not from a hand slapping it, but from pressure, like someone pressing their full palm against it, testing its strength. The RV wall hummed with the vibration. I could feel it beneath my feet. My phone finally lit up, illuminating my hand in cold blue light. I squinted at the screen. No signal. Not even a flicker of a bar. That was impossible. Earlier, I had full service. Even deep in the canyon, I'd never dropped completely offline. I whispered to myself, "You've got to be kidding me." Outside, gravel shifted again, but not like footsteps this time. More like something heavy had repositioned its weight. I killed the light on my phone. The window's blinds vibrated softly as the unseen presence slid downward, moving from the top of the window toward its midpoint, as though crouching. I backed toward the front of the RV. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Opening the door meant stepping into the same darkness that was holding this thing. And then the doorknob moved. Just slightly, just enough to click. I froze. The knob turned again, slow, testing. The deadbolt held. Thank God I'd locked it earlier, even if I hadn't known why. Another click. A slight rattling, a pause, and then I heard it again. My name. This time clearer. Closer. "Ivan," a whisper drawn out slowly, almost tender. The voice warped like someone trying to mimic speech through a throat not built for it. It was neither man nor woman. It was both. It was wrong in a way that made my stomach drop, as if the floor had fallen away. I stepped backward into the driver's seat, keeping my eyes on the door, my hand groping for the ignition. The keys were already there. I'd left them after checking battery levels earlier. My fingers shook so violently I dropped them at first, fumbling like a child. Outside, the whisper changed. Not words now. Breathing. Deep, steady breathing, right on the other side of the thin metal door, synced to my panic in a way that felt deliberate. I turned the key. The engine tried to crank, then choked. A sputter. A cough. Then nothing. No, come on. I turned it again. The starter clicked uselessly. The battery indicator flickered, then dropped into the red. My RV had been fine when I parked. More than fine. The breathing outside shifted into a low hum, as though whoever or whatever was standing there found amusement in my panic. I gripped the steering wheel and held myself still, trying to force air into my lungs, trying to regain control. I needed a plan. I needed clarity. But everything inside me felt scrambled. Then, in the midst of that panic, something unexpected happened. Another sound. From outside. Distant, but real. Human. A door opening. Footsteps. A man's voice clearing his throat. Someone else was awake. The breathing at my door stopped instantly. Not faded, not retreated, just stopped. As though frozen mid-motion. The footsteps outside drew closer. A camper walking to the restroom, I guessed. His sandals slapped gently against the gravel in an easy, half-awake rhythm. I dared to hope for a moment that this would break whatever was happening, that the presence outside my door would slip away into the dark and leave me alone. For a moment, it seemed like it did. Silence again. A long beat passed. Then, without warning, the doorknob twisted violently, rattling the door so hard the deadbolt strained. I flinched backward with a shout I couldn't suppress. The whole RV shook with the force of it. Not like someone trying to open it now, like someone angry. Like the thing outside was responding not to me, but to the approaching camper. The man outside called out, "Hello? Everything okay over there?" The doorknob stopped instantly. The presence retreated, faster than footsteps should move. I heard a rush of gravel, then nothing. Like something had simply melted into the darkness. The man hesitated, then called again. "You all right?" I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to work. "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry, just dropped something." He didn't seem convinced, but he continued toward the restroom, footsteps slowly fading. The moment he was gone, the silence returned, heavier now, more alert. I sat frozen in the driver's seat for several minutes, waiting for anything. A hint, a sound, a breath. But nothing came. No footsteps, no whisper, no pressure on the door, just stillness. Gradually, I let my hands drop from the steering wheel. My muscles ached. My throat felt raw. I knew I wouldn't sleep again, couldn't sleep. Not in this RV, not in this place. I needed to leave. Even without a working engine, I needed to get out. If I couldn't drive, I would cross the campground on foot to the ranger station. Dawn wasn't far off. I checked my phone again, still no signal, but the time read 4:31 a.m. I just needed to hold out until sunrise. If I stepped out now, the darkness still clinging to the canyon floor might swallow me whole. So I waited and waited until the faintest gray crept along the horizon. The river slowly returned to life, a soft rush that signaled morning. Birds began to chirp, tentative at first, then more confidently. The campground breathed again. It was as if none of the night had ever happened, as if the world had never been silent at all. But when I finally opened the RV door and stepped outside, the truth hit me harder than the cold morning air. All around my RV, circling it in uneven, overlapping loops, were footprints. Bare footprints. Human-sized, but wrong. Too long in the toes, too deep in the heel, and spaced in a way no normal stride could match. They led from nowhere and ended nowhere. Just circles around the RV, dozens of them, and right beside the door, printed clearly in the dust, was a single handprint. Not pressed flat, pressed sideways, dragging down the metal as if the hand had been bracing itself while listening. 5 fingers. Too slender. Too long. Palm too narrow. And a smear beneath like something had trailed off one of the fingertips. I stepped back, chilled to the bone despite the warming air. Something had been at my door for hours, watching, listening, calling my name, and it hadn't walked away. Not in the sense any human would recognize. Before I could process any of it, a voice behind me made me jump. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I spun around. An older woman stood at the next campsite over, gray hair, shaking hands, and eyes that looked like she hadn't slept in days. She pointed at the footprints, and then she whispered something that made the canyon feel suddenly smaller, tighter, as though the rock walls themselves were leaning in to hear. It came to my RV last night as well. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it cut through the morning air with the force of something undeniable. I stared at the woman, trying to read her expression. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition, old, exhausted recognition. She stepped closer, her gaze locked on the footprints circling my RV. "They're fresh," she murmured, "too fresh for the ground to have cooled yet." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean, it came to your RV?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she crouched near one of the prints, hovering her hand above it, not touching, just studying the shape. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled from something deeper than fear. It whispered to me too. My heartbeat kicked into overdrive, a heavy thud beneath my ribs. "Last night?" "No," she corrected quietly. "Every night since Monday." That stopped me cold. I looked again at the loops around my RV, every one of them disturbingly deliberate, as if the thing had been pacing, undecided, calculating. I tried to trace the prints outward, to find where they began or ended, but they dissolved into the gravel after a few feet, swallowed by the chaos of normal daytime footsteps. The woman, her name tag on a small hiking vest read Marlene, stood up slowly. "You heard the footsteps at 2 a.m., didn't you?" My mouth went dry. "How do you know the time?" She gave a humorless half smile. Because that's when it visits, right when everything stops, right when the canyon goes quiet. A shiver worked down my spine. What is it? Marlene shook her head. I don't think any of us have words for that. Us? I asked. How many people have heard? Before I could finish, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the campground loop. 2 sites away, a man stood outside his trailer, staring at the ground beneath his awning. His face was pale, jaw tight. I followed his gaze, another handprint, smaller, higher up on the window, as if it had leaned in close. He caught me looking and quickly turned away, shutting himself inside without a word. A third camper emerged from a tent farther down, Gus rubbing her arms in a nervous rhythm, scanning the tree line like she expected something to be standing there. Marlene exhaled shakily. At first I thought it was coyotes, then maybe a person wandering at night. But it doesn't walk like a person. She gestured at the footprints. It doesn't move like anything natural. I couldn't help asking quietly, why didn't you leave? Her eyes flickered. Because the first night I did try. I got in my truck, turned the key, and the engine wouldn't start. Same thing the second night, like something didn't want me to go. She paused, voice dipping lower, like it needed me to stay. My stomach dropped. My engine had died too. As if responding to my thoughts, my RV gave a soft, settling groan, metal expanding in the morning warmth. The sound made both of us jump. I walked over and opened the hood with trembling hands. The battery cable was intact. The terminals were clean. Nothing seemed loose, nothing damaged. Yet when I turned the key again, the engine only gave a weak sputter, then fell silent. Marlene watched with haunted understanding. It drains power somehow, or disrupts it. I don't know how, but it does. A ranger truck finally appeared near the campground entrance, rolling slowly down the main road, the morning shift arriving for rounds. Relief washed through me so suddenly I had to steady myself. We need to tell them, I said. Show them the prints. But Marlene didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the ridge of cliffs towering above the campground. Rangers already know, she said. Or they suspect. They get reports every spring. She nodded toward the approaching truck. Watch how he looks at the ground. He'll see the prints, and he won't say a word. The ranger, mid-30s, sunglasses, calm professional posture, stepped out and approached with an easy, neutral expression. Morning, he said. Everything all right at your site? Got a noise complaint from a nearby camper around 2 a.m. My throat tightened. Someone or something was outside my RV last night. He paused, expression unreadable. Did you see a person? I shook my head. I heard them. They circled the RV, knocked on the windows, tried the door. I gestured at the footprints, and they left those. He followed my hand to the prints. I watched carefully, waited for him to react with confusion, concern, something. But he only gave a slow exhale through his nose, as if he'd seen them before. When he finally spoke, his tone changed, subtly but unmistakably. Could be leftover tracks from earlier campers, or animals passing through. Marlene glared at him. Animals don't have feet like those. He didn't look at her. I'll file your concern, but there's not much we can do without identifying someone. Someone, not something. He gestured toward his radio. If you need help towing out, we can see if a vehicle assistance team is available. I almost laughed at the absurdity. The idea of staying here one more hour made my skin crawl. As the ranger walked back to his truck, I caught a faint exchange over his radio. Too quick to decode, but the tone was low, tense, not routine. Marlene stepped closer. You can wait for a tow, or... She lowered her voice. You can leave on foot. Hike to the visitor center. It's only a mile if you cut east along the river. Leave everything? I whispered. Her jaw tightened. Better than staying. I looked back at my RV, the place I had built with my hands, my sanctuary, my escape. But that door frame, that window, no longer felt like safety. I could still hear the whisper of my name as if it clung to the metal. I made my decision. Within minutes, I had a backpack stuffed with essentials, water, first aid kit, a flashlight, whatever I could grab without thinking too hard. I stepped out into the warming canyon air, locking the RV out of habit. even though I knew a lock meant nothing to whatever had been outside. Marlene walked with me at first, heading toward the trail along the Virgin River. Other campers watched us go, some with confusion, others with the same haunted look she had. Several sites still had unnatural footprints near them. We reached the path where the river curved eastward. The sun was just beginning to crest the canyon rim, the sack flooding the water with gold. Morning felt alive, loud, normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Marlene stopped where the trail forked. "I'm heading the other direction," she said quietly. "I need to pray at the Angel Landing trailhead." Her eyes softened. "Be careful out there. If it followed you once, it might again," I swallowed. "Does it follow people?" She gave a long, weary pause. "It follows voices." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me alone at the fork. I took the left trail toward the visitor center. The path wound through cottonwoods, the shade cool and calming. Birds chattered overhead. A pair of deer startled near the water. For a moment, the peacefulness almost convinced me the night had been some fever dream. But then I heard it. Behind me. A single crunch of gravel. I whipped around. The trail was empty. No hikers, no animals, no wind. Just one footprint pressed into the path's edge. Fresh, distinct, and wrong in the same way as the ones around my RV. My pulse hammered. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back on it, and that's when I heard the whisper again. So soft it might have been carried on the breeze. So close it felt like breath against the back of my neck. "Ivan." I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Not when branches clawed my arms, not when the ground sloped unevenly beneath me, not when the river roared louder to my right. I ran until I saw the familiar outline of the visitor center, until the voices of tourists and the hum of cars in the parking lot filled the air like a shield. Only then did I stop, and even then, only because my legs threatened to give out. The world seemed normal again, solid, human. But I knew the truth. The thing in the dark wasn't bound to the campground, and it hadn't been driven away by daylight. The whisper I'd heard on the trail still clung to my thoughts, curling there like a warning. I left Zion that day, but sometimes late at night when the world goes still, when the air feels heavier than it should, when silence presses against my windows, I swear I hear footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, knowing, and a voice that shouldn't know my name, but does, always does. I've always believed that some places carry a quiet memory of what's happened on them, like the ground itself refuses to forget. I didn't think much of that idea until the night the shadows behind my RV started moving in a way that forced me to question everything I thought I understood about the woods, about solitude, and about myself. My name is Ethan Granger. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in a flat stretch of Nebraska where the wind was always the loudest thing you heard. I'd been RV camping for more than a decade, chasing the feeling that life feels a little clearer, a little simpler, when you tuck yourself into a patch of wild land with nothing but aluminum walls and your own instincts to rely on. But August of 2022, Glacier Meadow, just outside the park boundary in northern Montana, that trip didn't make things clearer. It carved new shadows into me, ones I can't scrub out no matter how many miles I've driven since. I arrived at Glacier Meadow on a Tuesday afternoon. The place seemed peaceful enough. Wide, hilly pastures giving way to thick stands of pines, the late summer air warm and slow, the sky too blue to take seriously. The campground was sparsely populated that week. A few fifth wheels scattered near the tree line, a Class A parked near the entrance, and maybe 2 or 3 tents tucked against the tall grass. I'd chosen a back-end site near a narrow corridor of forest, mostly for privacy, partly because I liked the way the light cut through the branches. But looking back, the spot already felt a bit too quiet. Not silent, just quiet in the way someone gets quiet when they're holding something back. That first night, nothing unusual happened. I grilled a simple dinner, watched the sky turn the color of thinned-out ember, and took in that sharp pine scent you only get in the mountains after sunset. The temperature dropped quicker than I expected, carrying that dry metallic bite that makes you exhale in foggy ribbons. I slept like a stone. The second night, though, that's when things shifted. It was around 11:30 p.m. A breeze was moving lazily through the trees, and the distant hum of someone's generator provided a steady, almost comforting backdrop. I was reading inside my RV when I heard what I thought was a footstep outside. Just one. A single deliberate compression of ground. Not a twig crack, not an animal shuffle. This sounded heavier, slower. I froze, listening. Silence. I tried to shrug it off. Campgrounds at night are full of strange noises. Branches dropping, raccoons turning over something they probably shouldn't, the restless movement of other campers adjusting something outside. But something about that single step tugged at a feeling in the back of my ribs, like an instinct that had been asleep jolting upright. I waited a minute, then two. Nothing. I opened the small window near my bed and leaned closer, listening for any shift in air or foliage. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Even the breeze seemed to pause. After a few minutes, I let it go. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to ruin the trip by spiraling into paranoia. Maybe because I didn't want to admit I felt something colder than the night air moving inside me. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and eventually drifted into a light, unsettled sleep. But just before dawn, maybe around 4:30 a.m., I woke to the sensation that something was standing close to the RV. Not touching it. Just near it. That's the best way I can describe it. The way you can sense someone standing behind you in a quiet room, even if they never speak a word. My body reacted before my mind did. My pulse hammered, my breath tightened. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, listening. The silence outside felt thick, padded, as if the world was trying to keep a secret. Then something brushed the gravel near my rear bumper. Not walked over it, brushed it. Something moving low, dragging lightly. I sat upright so fast I felt lightheaded. My first thought was bear, but the sound wasn't right. Bears move with weight, with careless confidence. This sound was too controlled, too careful. When I finally gathered enough nerve to inch toward the window above the sink, I lifted one slat of the blind just enough to peer outside. Pitch black, no motion, no shape, just that faint, strange pressure in the dark. I didn't sleep again. By morning, the feeling had retreated the way fog does, slowly, reluctantly. But it clung to me. I stepped outside, half expecting to see tracks, but the dew on the grass was untouched. The gravel near the bumper looked no different than it had the previous afternoon. I checked behind the RV. Nothing. No dents, no scratches, no scuffs. Just open space and the beginning of a warm Montana sunrise. I tried to rationalize it as a dream mixing with a noise from another nearby camper. Maybe someone got up in the night to take their dog out. Maybe an animal moved in a way I wasn't used to hearing. Thinking like that made the next several hours tolerable, but it didn't erase the feeling. We always talk about fear like it's an emotion that arrives suddenly, but real fear, the kind that crawls under your skin and lives there, starts much quieter. It whispers before it ever raises its voice. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Clouds thickened over the mountains, forming a dark quilt that seemed too heavy to stay suspended. I wandered the campground a bit, partly to clear my head, partly because staying in the RV alone felt strangely suffocating. I chatted briefly with a couple from Arizona who were staying 2 sites down. Friendly people, mid-60s, traveling in a small Class C. They didn't notice anything strange the night before, except the wife mentioned hearing an odd scraping sound near dawn, but figured it was the wind. That caught me. Scraping? Near dawn? I asked her what direction she'd heard it from. She pointed vaguely toward the corridor of trees that backed up to both of our sites, the same direction where I'd felt that presence. A chill crawled up the inside of my arms, but I smiled, thanked her, and walked on. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully enough, but I couldn't shake the thought, why would scraping carry that far unless it was something big or deliberate? That evening, the temperature dropped sharply. A storm was rolling in, Nothing violent, just one of those cold front showers that makes the air feel electrically charged. I grilled a quick dinner and retreated inside as the first light drops pattered against the roof. By 10 p.m., the rain had settled into a soft, steady rhythm, almost comforting. I almost convinced myself the previous night had been nothing worth remembering. But around midnight, the sound changed. The rain kept falling, but beneath it, something else, faint at first, a rhythm that didn't fit the weather, a slow, irregular tapping against the back of the RV. Not metal, not gravel. Something softer, like knuckles brushing lightly, testing the surface. Tap, 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 tap. My throat went dry. I stepped closer, each breath shallow, my legs tight with that instinctual urge to run even though there was nowhere to go. The tapping stopped the moment I reached the kitchen counter, as if whatever was outside sensed me approaching. Then a shadow slid across the thin curtain over the back window. Not a passing shape, not a trick of headlights. A shadow that moved with intention, slow, gliding, as if it were leaning in, studying the window. Studying me. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my teeth. The shadow's shape was wrong. Too tall, too narrow at the top, widening lower, like a torso without proper shoulders. It hesitated mid-frame, then drifted out of sight with unnatural smoothness. I didn't breathe for several seconds. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, silence pooled in the corners like a thick, invisible substance. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body pulling tight as wire. I grabbed the flashlight, though I wasn't sure why. I knew damn well I wasn't stepping outside, but holding something solid felt like a way to anchor myself to reality. I stood in the center of the RV, listening as the tapping started again, this time farther back, lower, like fingertips dragging across the bottom edge of the rear panel. Something was behind the RV, something moving low to the ground, slow, deliberate, something that didn't care about the rain, something that wanted to feel its way along the metal. And I realized with a cold rush of clarity that whatever I'd sensed the night before wasn't my imagination. It had been waiting. And now it was back. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the flashlight like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The tapping changed, slowed, stopped, then resumed with a rhythm so hesitant it felt like whatever was behind the RV was trying to memorize its shape. A wet scrape, a dragging sound following the curve of the bumper. My skin tightened as if the air itself was shrinking around me. I forced myself to move, not toward the door, never toward the door, but toward the front of the RV, where I could at least see the empty stretch of campground ahead. The rain had softened the world outside into a watery blur. Every shape looked slightly wrong. Trees leaned differently in the dark. The picnic table seemed farther from its original spot. Even the nearest RVs looked like they'd inched forward when I wasn't looking. I tried to steady my breathing. Panic makes its own noise, and I was terrified that anything I did, any movement, any breath might draw whatever was behind me closer. The air felt electrified, like the atmosphere before lightning strikes. My mind spun through explanations. Bear, mountain lion, stray dog, drunk camper, but none matched the shape I'd seen, the height, the impossibly smooth way it moved. Wind pressed against the RV in an uneven push. The back window curtain fluttered slightly, and I snapped my head toward it instinctively. My heart thudded with a pulse so sharp it hurt. Then the tapping stopped entirely. I didn't know which was worse, the presence or the silence it left behind. Rain pattered faintly. Thunder rumbled miles away. The RV creaked, the way thin walls do in cold weather. But behind me, near the back end, nothing moved. No scraping, no dragging, just absence. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. The quiet felt staged. I crept toward the side window and positioned myself low, peeking carefully through a narrow gap in the blinds. My own reflection hovered faintly over the glass, but beyond it, rain streaked down the pane and blurred everything into shadow. The forest looked like a single undulating wall, shifting in the wind. I scanned the area, inch by inch. Nothing. Nothing. Then, a figure stood just at the edge of visibility, near the tree line. Not close, not far. Just waiting. Its outline was distorted by the rain, making it look as if parts of its body didn't fully line up, as if some pieces lagged a fraction of a second behind. My lungs seized. It was tall, but not unnaturally tall, maybe 6.5 feet. But its posture held a strange, unnatural slant, like its spine bent in too many places. A long arm hung at its side, the elbow nearly reaching its waist. And its head, God. Its head was angled down, facing the ground as if it were studying something directly below it, or listening. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the rain was distorting the view, but when my eyes refocused, the figure was already gone, not moved. Gone. The tree line stood empty, swaying with the storm. I stumbled back from the window, hitting the counter behind me with enough force that a mug rattled. My pulse slammed against the side of my neck. I backed away until I reached the couch, lowering myself onto it only because my knees felt too unreliable to hold me. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every nerve in my body stayed lit, like someone had jammed a live wire into my spine. I waited for the tapping to return, but the hours stretched thin and empty. Rain faded. Wind softened. The storm passed. Dawn approached with a slow gray wash over the hills. When the sky finally lightened enough to make out details, I forced myself to look outside again. That was my mistake. The ground behind my RV, still damp from rain, held tracks, but not footprints, not paw prints, something else. Long, shallow impressions as if someone had dragged something heavy and narrow like a plank or a limb through the gravel. The marks curved around the back of the RV, then stopped abruptly just before reaching the trees, as if whatever made them had stood there, watching. The idea struck me so hard I felt dizzy. Had it watched me through the thin walls all night? I swallowed hard, trying to force down the rising panic. I scanned the campground. A few other campers moved about, starting breakfast or stretching in the cold. Normal. Ordinary. Blissfully unaware. For a moment I considered leaving right then, packing everything, hitching up, driving until the mountains were a memory in the rear view. But my rational brain fought back. Fear makes you jump at shadows. Fear warps proportions. The tracks could have been made by something dragging a tarp or a branch or a piece of gear someone dropped. But then I remembered the shadow moving behind the window. No branch moves like that. Still, leaving felt like admitting I had no control over my own senses, and I wasn't ready to give up control. Not yet. That day, I stayed close to my RV. I walked the trail leading along the meadow, watched the sky change from gray to bright blue, tried to breathe normally again. By late afternoon, I began to convince myself I'd misinterpreted everything. Stress, overactive imagination, bad sleep, even the dragging sound could have been weather or debris rolling in the wind. Around 8 p.m., I made dinner. The air was calm, clear, beautifully cold. A bright, full moon was rising behind the pines, illuminating the campground in that pale silver light that makes everything look dreamlike. I almost felt foolish for being so terrified. Almost. Until I saw the shape, not behind the RV this time, in front, between me and the nearest group of campers, maybe 30 yards away. A silhouette, motionless, standing half in the moonlight, half in shadow, facing me. I froze. The spatula slipped from my hand and clattered onto the ground. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't lean back, just stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted as though trying to determine something about me. A question hanging in the air between us. My throat tightened so violently I couldn't swallow. Then, in a slow, horrible motion, the figure raised one arm. Not a wave, not a threat, just a slow, deliberate lift, as if acknowledging me, as if confirming that it knew where I was and that it had been waiting for the moment I stepped outside. My legs reacted before my mind. I backed toward the RV door, hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the handle. My heart felt like it was trying to punch through my ribs. The figure didn't move from its spot. But something else did. A second shape peeled away from the tree line beside it, lower to the ground, crawling or dragging itself with elongated limbs. It slithered into the moonlight for only a second, but that was enough for me to see its distorted outline, the way its body seemed too flexible, its joints bending in unnatural angles. Panic surged through me in a white-hot rush. I yanked the RV door open, jumped inside, locked it, then locked it again. Curtains drawn, lights off, every muscle in my body tight as steel cables. I couldn't hear anything outside, not footsteps, not dragging, not breathing, just the pounding of my own heartbeat filling the silence. Minutes crawled, then an hour, then 2. I sat in darkness, barely moving, listening. And just when I thought maybe the figures had left, maybe the fear was starting to dull, I heard it, a soft inhalation. Not outside, under the RV, a slow, wet breath like something trying to steady itself, or scent something, followed by a faint shift of weight beneath the floor. My skin went cold. Something was lying under the RV, directly beneath where I sat, listening. I didn't breathe for nearly a full minute. My vision dimmed at the edges, too much terror in too little air. But I didn't move, not a finger, not a single muscle. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the breathing faded. The pressure in the floor eased, and then silence. A silence so complete I didn't trust it. I stayed frozen until dawn. Only when sunlight pushed through the blinds did I finally muster the courage to look. Outside, the ground was undisturbed. The tracks from the morning were washed even more faintly now. No silhouettes. No shapes, no sign that anything had existed outside my imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I know what moved behind the RV, and beneath it. I left Glacier Meadow that morning. I haven't returned, not to Montana, not to that valley. And it's strange, because RV camping used to be where I felt the most alive. But now, every time I pull into a quiet campground, every time the night settles a little too heavily, I feel it again, that presence slipping around the edge of perception, that shadow sliding where it shouldn't. Sometimes late at night, even hundreds of miles away, I still hear it, that careful tapping, low, slow, searching, as if whatever found me in Glacier Meadow is still out there, still learning the shape of my RV. I still remember the sound, not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. A single knock, sharp and hollow, like someone rapped their knuckles against the thin shell of my RV just to let me know they were there. One knock was all it took to rewire the way I look at nighttime in a campground. One knock, and suddenly the entire desert around Lake Havasu felt alive in a way I wish I could forget. My name is Eli Navarro. I was 44 years old the spring this happened, and I'd been traveling solo in my fifth wheel for a couple of years by then. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't cautious either. Not the way I should have been. Back then, I believed danger had a look, a shape, a predictable outline I could spot from a distance. But the truth is that most threats start with a feeling, a sliver of unease that whispers long before anything actually goes wrong. And that was what started gnawing at me the moment I rolled into the campground on the Arizona side of Lake Havasu in March of 2021. I'd chosen the place because it was quiet, tucked back from the water, with long gravel pads and a few scraggly desert shrubs that offered just enough privacy without isolating you completely. The kind of place where the wind carries every sound a little too far, and the night sky makes you feel both small and watched at the same time. I'd camped in the Southwest dozens of times, but something about this spot tugged at me from the start. Not a warning exactly, more like the faint hum before a power line arcs. I told myself not to overthink it. That was always my flaw. Too many instincts I brushed aside because they felt inconvenient. I'd spent most of my life convincing myself that internal warnings were exaggerated, that fear was a leftover survival reflex from a generation that didn't have comfort, roads, or running lights on their rigs. I believed in logic, in probability, in statistics, and the math always told me the same thing. Campgrounds are safe. I should have known better. That first afternoon was uneventful, if a little quiet. A retired couple parked a few sites over, their diesel engine coughing itself to sleep long after they shut it off. Another RV, a newer Class C with blacked-out windows, was positioned closer to the entrance. I never saw anyone come out of it. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I shrugged it off, grateful for the extra space around my site. The wind picked up around sunset. Warm gusts swept through the gravel, kicking soft plumes of dust across the ground. Lake Havasu looked like glass cracked by ripples and fading light. I walked the perimeter of the campground with a mug of coffee in my hand, the kind that tastes like roasted dirt but smells like home. I watched shadows stretch long and thin behind the mesquite trees, watched them sway in ways that made them look like people wandering between the campsites. My anxiety ticked up a notch, but I pushed it down. "It's the desert," I said out loud, as if hearing the words would make them true. Things move weird out here. Back at my RV, I extended the slide out just like I always did. Leveled the rig, locked the truck, went through the normal steps, grounding myself in routine. But there was a strange sense of pressure in the air, like I was prepping for something without realizing what. The first odd thing happened just after dark. I was sitting at my small dinette, laptop open, trying to answer emails, when I felt a small vibration under my feet. Not shaking, vibration, a kind of thump that traveled through the subfloor, subtle but impossible to ignore. I froze, listening. Another vibration. Then nothing. Mice, I thought. Maybe a desert hare brushing against the underside. But it didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, like movement with weight. I stood up, bracing one hand on the wall to steady myself. I listened for footsteps outside, for voices, for anything. But the campground was still, and the wind had died down completely. I stepped outside with a flashlight and swept the narrow beam across the gravel. I didn't see tracks or movement, just the shifting shadows of my own rig against the pale dirt. I checked every stabilizer, every corner, every inch around the slide out. Nothing. Back inside, I tried to laugh it off. Long day. Too much caffeine. A wandering mind making something out of nothing. I'd had moments like that before. Sound can play weird tricks on you in isolated campgrounds. But as the air cooled and the night thickened around me, I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling creeping up my spine. I forced myself into bed around midnight. The desert was silent except for the distant hum of something. Maybe a generator, maybe highway noise carried on the breeze. I left one small light on above the kitchen, its glow casting a soft yellow line across the hallway. It made the inside of the RV feel smaller, like the walls were inching closer with every passing minute. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually my body surrendered, and that's when it happened. The knock. One sharp, hollow strike directly on the slide-out wall beside my bed. My eyes snapped open. For the first few seconds, I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, to shove the sound into some rational category. A branch hitting the side, no trees near the slide-out. An animal jumping, nothing that big moves that quietly. Something falling inside, everything was secured. Knock. The second one was softer, but closer. Lower, like it came from just beneath the edge of the slide-out floor. The vibration crawled through the mattress into my ribcage. I sat up slowly, my heart punching against my sternum hard enough to hurt. My breath came out thin and sharp, and my mind did that thing it always does when fear gets too real. It split into two voices. One trying to stay logical, the other whispering the things I already knew deep down. The logical voice said, "Someone is messing with you. Kids, a prank, a drunk camper, noise traveling weird in the desert." The other voice said, "You are not alone outside that wall, and whatever is there is not walking away." I reached for my phone with shaking fingers. No signal, of course. Knock. This time it wasn't a knuckle sound. It was the flat thud of a palm. Slow, intentional, like someone wanted to see if I'd respond. I didn't call out. I didn't shine a light at the wall. I didn't even shift the mattress. I just listened, every nerve on fire, waiting for the next clue, for footsteps, for breathing, for something. But there was nothing, only the stillness that follows after something takes one step too close. I eased myself off the bed and onto the floor, careful not to creak. My knees felt locked, stiff with tension. The faint glow from the kitchen light barely reached the bedroom, but it was enough for me to see my own hands trembling. I moved toward the living area, each step slow and measured. I kept expecting to hear someone dragging a hand across the outside wall or testing the door handle. The silence made it worse. Silence meant they were waiting. By the time I reached the entryway, my breath was unsteady and my chest felt tight. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet, but curiosity, stupid, stubborn curiosity, pulled me toward the door. I pressed my ear against it. The metal was cold, too cold for a desert night. And then I heard it. Not a knock, not footsteps. Breathing, deep, rhythmic, calm breathing just on the other side. Not human, not animal. Something in between, or something pretending to be one or the other. My throat closed up, my hands curled into fists at my sides. All the little red flags from earlier, the vibration, the empty Class C, the quiet sight, rushed back into me in a single crushing wave. Something had been waiting for nightfall, and now it was right outside my door. Every muscle in my body locked as that slow, steady breathing pressed itself against the thin RV door. The sound wasn't heavy or labored. It wasn't the panting of someone trying to intimidate me. It was measured, controlled. Like whoever, or whatever, stood there was perfectly calm while I was unraveling from the inside out. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in my own ears. The breathing stopped instantly. That quiet, God, that quiet was worse than the knocking, worse than the vibration under the floor. At least noise gives you a direction, a pattern, a reason. Silence lets you imagine everything else. I shifted my weight ever so slightly to keep my balance. The RV creaked under me, a small, almost imperceptible sound. But it was enough. The breathing started again, this time lower, near the bottom edge of the door. Then it dragged sideways, like the source of it was moving along the threshold, sniffing or listening or testing something. My jaw tightened. Instinct told me not to step back. Predators chase retreat. But another part of me, the part that remembered stories from childhood, warnings whispered around campfires, told me that this thing wasn't behaving like any normal trespasser. I kept one hand on the deadbolt. I didn't unlock it. I wasn't suicidal. But gripping the lock made me feel like I had control, even if that was a lie. The breathing stopped again. This time, something tapped lightly against the thin metal near my knee. Not a knock, not a scrape. Just a soft, almost curious tap, like a fingertip or a claw. A shiver shot up my spine. Whatever was outside wasn't large. If it had been a person, I would have heard gravel shifting under their boots. If it had been an animal, the breathing would have sounded different, more primal. But this was deliberate, delicate, like something approximating human behavior without fully understanding it. My skin felt too tight, my heartbeat too loud. The air felt thinner than it should have been. I forced myself to step back from the door, one small shuffle at a time. The breathing stopped every time I paused, like it was reacting to the faintest vibration from inside. The moment I put more distance between us, I felt it, a tremor in the floorboards, like weight shifting against the exterior wall. It was moving. Whatever stood at my door was walking, slow, patient steps toward the slide out again. And that was the moment the fear changed. Before that, I'd been scared of an intruder, someone trying to break in, someone messing with me, maybe a vagrant or someone unstable. But when I felt that change in pressure near the slide-out wall, the same wall where my bed sat, my mind went someplace darker. It wasn't trying to get inside, it was trying to get close. I crept toward the small window near the kitchen. I didn't turn on another light. I kept everything exactly as it was, dim, still, quiet. My fingers slipped along the blinds, separating two slats just enough to peer through them. At first, I saw nothing but gravel and moonlight. The desert looked washed out, colorless as if drained by the darkness. Shadows hung low along the ground, unmoving. The shrubs beside my sight swayed only slightly, barely touched by the wind. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no movement, just Arizona at night, empty and open. But then something shifted at the edge of my vision. A shape. Small, low to the ground, not crawling, sliding, as if its body didn't move in individual steps, but glided in one silent motion. It was inches from the slide out. I didn't blink, couldn't. In the pale light, I could make out the curve of a shoulder, the angle of a head, but not the details. The thing was turned away from me, facing the same wall it had knocked on. Its outline was wrong, too narrow in some places, too long in others. Not animal, not human. Something in between, or something that was trying to imitate one or the other and failing. And then it lifted a hand. A hand, 5 fingers, too long, too thin, like they were stretched, like tendons pulled taut beneath skin that didn't fit quite right. It laid that hand flat against the slide-out wall and leaned its head against the RV, not pressing, listening, like it was trying to hear me inside. As if the entire structure were some kind of instrument and it was waiting to hear what note I would strike. My throat tightened until it hurt. I slipped back from the window, unable to watch any longer, afraid even the slight shift of the blinds would draw its attention. I crouched down behind the small kitchen counter, pulling in on myself, trying to make my body quiet, trying to make my breath so slow and shallow it wouldn't tremble the air. For a moment, the campground was so still I could hear the faint ticking of the fridge compressor cycling on. The tiny sound almost comforted me, something normal, something expected. Then the knocking returned. Not one knock. 3, slow, purposeful, right against the slide-out, the same spot where the figure's hand had been. Knock, knock, knock. Each one reverberated through the floor and into my bones. Every instinct screamed at me. Do not react, do not move, do not speak. Then came the worst part. It began to drag that same hand across the wall, a slow, smooth glide. No nails, no scratching, just friction, skin against fiberglass. A soft, persistent whisper of movement. Then it stopped. Silence again. I braced myself, biting down on my tongue to keep from gasping when the vibration hit, a deep, almost subsonic thud beneath the slide out, like something heavy shifting its weight directly underneath me. I felt it travel through my knees where they touched the floor. Whatever it was under my slide out. My breath hitched, a sound I couldn't hide. The slide out wall creaked, not from wind, from pressure. It pressed against the underside, not trying to lift it, not trying to crawl in, just pressing, testing, measuring the structure, feeling its reactions like it was learning. I couldn't stay still anymore. Panic won. I backed away, fast and clumsy, bumping the cupboard door. The noise echoed louder than it should have, like guilt shouting through the RV. The pressure under the slide-out stopped instantly. I froze. Then I heard the gravel outside shift. Not footsteps, but a long sliding motion, something pulling itself out from beneath the overhang, something rising. The shape passed by the bedroom window, a tall, wrong silhouette blotting out the moon for a moment. My heart nearly stopped. And then the breathing returned, right outside the window this time, slow, intentional. Calmer than mine by a mile. It didn't knock, it didn't move, it just stood there, listening. I placed my hand over my own mouth to muffle the sound of my breath. My lungs burned from holding back everything inside me. A minute passed, then another. Each second stretched until it felt like a rope tightening around my ribs. Then, slowly, it exhaled, a long, low exhale that fogged the window from the outside. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just breathing near the glass. It was close enough to fog it, close enough to see me. The fogged patch trembled, and then something dragged through it. A finger, one of those long, too thin fingers. It traced a slow arc downward, leaving a clean trail through the condensation. My insides turned cold. It wasn't trying to get in. It was marking the glass, as if leaving a sign, a reminder, a message. My hands shook uncontrollably. I backed away until I hit the opposite wall. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. Then, as quietly as it had come, the shape drifted away from the window. I didn't hear footsteps, just that unsettling, sliding motion moving farther into the darkness. It didn't run, it didn't haft, like it had gotten what it came for. And the terrifying part? I had absolutely no idea what that was. I didn't move for a long time after it drifted away from the window. My mind kept trying to make sense of what I had seen, what I had heard, what had breathed against my door like it was smelling the life inside my chest. Nothing in my brain had a category for it. Every explanation I'd ever used to comfort myself on the road, wildlife, weird acoustics, pranksters, drunk campers, collapsed under the weight of what I'd witnessed. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then at least 30 more before I dared stand again. My legs felt brittle, like my bones had turned into hollow reeds. I kept my back firmly against the far wall, scanning the windows, listening for the faintest suggestion of movement outside. But the campground was silent. A normal kind of silent this time. No breathing, no gliding footsteps, no palm tapping against fiberglass. Just the low hum of distant crickets and the faint rustle of wind returning to the desert. I didn't trust it. I crawled to the small dinette, pulling myself up as quietly as I could. My phone still had no service. The campground's Wi-Fi, which had been weak earlier, was now dead entirely. I considered turning on every light in the RV, blasting it with brightness so intense any shadow would have nowhere to hide, but that instinct felt childish. Light wasn't the thing protecting me. Distance was. And the thing outside, it didn't seem afraid of light anyway. It wasn't trying to sneak in. It was observing, learning, listening. That thought nearly knocked the breath out of me again. I turned the blinds just enough to see a slice of the world outside. Moonlight coated the gravel in a cold, almost metallic sheen. The desert shrubs moved slightly in the wind. Nothing else shifted. No tall silhouette, no sideways sliding shape, no out-of-place shadow clinging too close to the walls. For the first time since the knocking began, the world looked normal. It didn't comfort me. I forced myself to think. Fear was choking me, twisting logic until everything felt distorted. I needed clarity, any amount of it, to decide what to do next. Staying put was the worst option. Every instinct I had screamed that the longer I remained inside this RV, the longer I was offering myself as prey, a stationary target, a known location. That thing had pressed its face against my window to breathe on it. It had laid its hand against the wall over my bed. It had crawled beneath my slide-out. It knew exactly where I was. Leaving, though, leaving meant stepping into the same darkness where that thing moved completely silently. Leaving meant crossing open ground. Leaving meant hoping my truck, parked 10 feet from the entry, wasn't being watched at that very moment. But between dying inside my RV or running for my truck, fear made the choice for me. I grabbed only what I needed, my keys, my wallet, my boots. I left everything else, every piece of gear, every sentimental object, every trace of my life on the road. I wasn't planning to come back for it. I moved toward the door, every movement deliberate, controlled. I pressed my hand against the metal, cold again, unnaturally cold, and felt the trembling in my arm. I told myself to breathe. Slow, quiet, measured. I eased the deadbolt open, then the second lock, then the latch. The door shifted with a soft groan. I froze. Nothing moved outside. I opened the door another inch. Then another. Until the night air seeped in, dry and warm, a contradiction to the cold metal I'd just touched. The desert looked harmless. The gravel sat still. The shrubs lay quiet. The entire campground slept with the innocence of a place that had no idea what wandered through it. I stepped out. The gravel under my boots, crunching, felt like an alarm. Loud. Exposed. A flare shot into the void. I winced with every step toward the truck, my eyes sliding to every shadow, every angle where the moonlight bent strangely. I expected it to appear again, at the corner of my vision, rising from behind my RV, unfolding from beneath the slide-out where it had crouched earlier. I expected that awful, steady breathing to return. But nothing happened. I reached the truck. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the key fob. The tiny click of the lock, disengaging, echoed like a gunshot across the empty campground. I climbed inside and slammed the door shut, not caring about noise anymore, and hit the ignition. The engine roared to life, loud and bullish, flooding my chest with a rush of relief. Headlights washed across my RV, and that's when I saw it. A mark on the fogged portion of the bedroom window. A long, arched streak, and beside it 3 smaller lines running parallel. Not scratches, not cracks, finger marks. But the distance between the 3 thin lines, far too wide to belong to a normal hand, made my stomach twist. It had left it there on purpose. A signature, a reminder, a promise. My breath shattered inside my chest. I floored the gas and tore out of the sight so fast, gravel spit in every direction behind me. The truck fishtailed slightly on the loose ground, but I didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't look back. Not once, only when I reached the main highway, when the yellow lanes stretched like a lifeline under my headlights, did I realize I was shaking from head to toe. My muscles spasmed with leftover adrenaline. My throat felt raw from silent screaming. My jaw ached from clenching so hard, but I kept driving. All night, until the sun finally began bleeding across the horizon hours later. Even then, I didn't stop. I didn't pull over until I was more than 2 hours away from Lake Havasu, parked in the lot of a gas station that didn't open until morning. I shut off the engine and rested my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to will myself into believing I had survived something ordinary. But I hadn't. What I'd seen wasn't a person, wasn't an animal, wasn't anything I'd ever heard about in 2 decades of camping. It was something else entirely. The worst part? I could still feel the moment its breath fogged the glass. Still see the long finger dragging through the condensation, still sense the intelligence in its stillness, the curiosity in its knocking. It hadn't tried to break in because it didn't need to. It had been studying me, and somewhere deep inside, a thought rooted itself that I've never managed to shake. It hadn't followed me that night, not because it couldn't, but because it wasn't finished. Even now, years later, I avoid slide-outs on the road. I avoid desert campgrounds. I avoid any site where the shadows stretch long and thin and patient. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm parked somewhere quiet, I hear a sound I've never learned to ignore. A faint vibration under the floor, a soft tap on the wall, a slow, steady breathing that isn't mine. And each time it happens, I remember that mark on the fogged glass, that silent promise, that midnight in Lake Havasu when something found me and decided it wanted more than fear. It wanted me to remember it, and I do. Every night, I don't think it ever left. The first thing I noticed wasn't the sound. It was the feeling that the night had leaned closer to listen. My name is Caleb Morgan. I was 38 that fall, born and raised in Western North Carolina. The kind of guy who learned early that quiet doesn't always mean safe. I'd been RV camping for over a decade by then, long enough to trust routine, long enough to believe that preparation could tame unpredictability. That belief is what carried me north into Virginia in October of 2020, climbing the Blue Ridge Parkway until the road narrowed and Shenandoah opened itself like a dark lung breathing fog into the valleys. Loft Mountain Campground sits high, exposed in a way that makes you feel both elevated and watched. The trees don't close in tight there. They stand apart, tall and thin, like witnesses who refuse to look at one another. It was late in the season. Most families were gone, kids back in school, summer laughter drained from the asphalt loops. That's why I chose it. I told myself I wanted solitude. What I really wanted was silence that would let my thoughts settle. I parked my old Volkswagen Rialta on a slight slope, backed up against a line of oaks stripped bare by early frost. The air smelled metallic, like wet leaves and distant stone, cold enough to make your breath feel sharp in your chest. I remember stepping out, shutting the door, and feeling that momentary disorientation you get at altitude, like the ground hesitates before accepting your weight. There were other rigs scattered around, but far enough away that their presence felt theoretical. A fifth wheel 2 loops down. A pickup with a camper shell tucked behind a stand of trees. No campfires burning. No radios. Just wind combing through branches, dragging dry leaves across the gravel in uneven bursts. I told myself this was perfect. That night, I cooked inside the RV, listening to the weather report crackle through static. No storms, clear skies, temperatures dipping into the low 30s, ideal sleeping weather. I locked the door out of habit, not fear, and pulled the shades down one by one, sealing myself into the familiar, narrow comfort of the cabin. By 9, the campground had gone completely still. It's hard to explain how silence changes when it becomes total. At first it feels expansive, then it starts to press, Every small sound inside the RV, the hum of the fridge, the click of cooling metal, feels too loud, almost rude. I lay on my side, facing the outer wall, listening to my own breathing and the occasional pop of the propane heater cycling on and off. That's when I smelled it. Not strong, just wrong. A damp, sour note threaded through the clean, cold air like soil turned too deep. I sat up and sniffed again, checking the sink, the trash, the seals around the windows. Nothing. The smell faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind a faint unease I couldn't pin to anything real. I lay back down. A few minutes later, something brushed the outside wall of the RV. Not a knock, not a scrape. A drag. Slow and deliberate, like fabric pulled along aluminum. I held my breath, listening for the follow-up sound that would explain it. A branch in the wind, an animal passing through. Nothing came. The forest stayed still. I waited, counting seconds in my head. Then it happened again, closer this time, lower. The Rialta isn't big. When something touches it, you feel it everywhere. A subtle vibration through the frame, a tremor through the mattress. I told myself it was a deer. They're curious. They rub against things. I'd seen it before. I clung to that explanation because it fit neatly into my understanding of the world. Still, I didn't move. The heater clicked on. Warm air rushed through the vents, and with it came that smell again. Wet earth, copper, something faintly animal. My throat tightened. I swallowed and forced myself to sit up, heart tapping too fast against my ribs. I turned on the small overhead light. The inside of the RV snapped into clarity. The kitchenette. The narrow aisle. The driver's seat looming like a silent observer, everything exactly where it should be. I laughed under my breath. A quick, humorless sound meant more for courage than amusement. "Get a grip," I whispered, and immediately regretted breaking the quiet. Outside, something exhaled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was close. A slow, steady release of air, heavy enough to carry weight, close enough that I could feel it through the wall like breath-warming cold metal. My skin prickled. Every instinct I'd ever learned flared at once, screaming proximity, screaming wrongness. I froze. The breath came again, accompanied by a faint, irregular rhythm. Inhale, pause, exhale. Too measured to be wind, too controlled to be coincidence. I pressed my palm against the wall without thinking, pulling it back instantly when the aluminum felt warmer than it should have. My mind scrambled for logic. Bear, mountain air playing tricks. Someone walking too close in the dark. Each explanation collapsed under the simple fact that whatever was outside wasn't moving away. It was staying. I reached for my phone, hands slick with sweat, and checked the time. 11:43 p.m. No service, of course. The screen's glow felt obscene in the dark, a beacon advertising my presence. I turned it face down on the counter. Another breath, this one deeper, accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible sound like the beginning of a cough swallowed before it could fully form. That's when denial stopped working. I eased myself off the bed, every movement slow, deliberate. The floor creaked despite my care, the sound ricocheting inside the cabin. Outside, the breathing paused, the silence stretched thin and fragile like ice before it cracks. I stood there, inches from the wall, listening so hard my ears rang. Then something shifted its weight. The RV rocked, just slightly. Not enough to sway, but enough to register mass. Enough to tell me that whatever was out there was tall, heavy, close enough that if I reached out again, I might not be touching aluminum. I backed away, step by careful step, until my shoulders brushed the opposite counter. My thoughts spiraled, not into panic yet, but into a cold, focused dread. I realized, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that I hadn't heard any footsteps. No approach, no retreat, just presence. I considered opening the door, flooding the area with light, yelling. Every option felt wrong, predatory even, like making the first move in a game whose rules I didn't understand. The breathing resumed, slower now, as if matching my stillness, as if listening. I slid into the driver's seat without breaking eye contact with the wall, keys already in the ignition from earlier. My fingers hovered, trembling, over the steering column. The engine would be loud. The headlights bright. If this thing reacted badly to sudden noise, a sound interrupted my thoughts. 3 soft taps, not on the door, on the wall beside my head, measured, intentional, human in its restraint. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, heart hammering so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. The taps came again, slightly higher this time, tracing the outline of where my head would be if I were still standing by the bed. Whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream, to bolt, to do anything but sit frozen in that narrow seat, trapped between instinct and fear. The air inside the RV felt thick now, heavy with that damp, coppery smell seeping through cracks I hadn't known existed. Another breath brushed the wall, closer than before, and then the tapping stopped. I waited, muscles screaming, time stretching into something unrecognizable, until a new sound began to form outside, low, wet, deliberate, like something shifting its mouth, preparing to speak, or worse, preparing to press closer. I knew then that staying still was no longer an option. I turned the key before my fear could talk me out of it. The engine coughed once, a dry mechanical bark that felt painfully loud in the small cabin, then roared to life with a vibration that shook the cabinets and rattled the loose change in the cup holder. The headlights flooded the campsite in a harsh white cone, slicing through fog and shadow, painting the trees in flat, unforgiving detail. Whatever had been breathing beside the wall moved. I didn't see it clearly, not all at once, but I saw enough. A shape pulled back from the side of the RV, retreating just beyond the edge of the headlights. Tall, too tall. Its outline bent at angles that didn't quite make sense, shoulders sloping forward as if it were hunched or unwilling to fully stand upright. For a split second, I caught the pale suggestion of skin where fur or clothing should have been, stretched tight and reflective like something damp. It didn't run. It stepped away slowly, deliberately, as if it understood that the light had shifted the balance but not ended the encounter. My foot slammed down on the brake when instinct screamed at me to hit the gas. I don't know why I stopped. Curiosity, maybe, or the part of me that still clung to the belief that if I could just see it clearly, it would become ordinary, explainable, less terrifying. The thing turned its head. That movement, so small, so casual, broke something inside me. Heads are supposed to turn smoothly. This one didn't. It tilted first, then rotated, like it was compensating for joints that didn't align the way mine did. The face stayed mostly in shadow, but I saw enough to know it wasn't an animal. Too flat, too still. No eye shine, no reflective glow. Just a darker patch where eyes should catch light, watching from inside the dark rather than reflecting it. My breath came in short, sharp pulls. The windshield fogged instantly. My own reflection ghosting back at me, wide eyes, pale skin, mouth hanging open in disbelief. I felt suddenly exposed, like the glass was thinner than it had any right to be. The thing took another step back, then another, retreating toward the trees with that same careful slowness. No fear, no urgency, just patience. That's when it lifted one arm, not to wave, not to threaten. It pressed its hand flat against the trunk of an oak, fingers splayed too long, too thin, the joints bending slightly backward. The bark creaked under the pressure. I heard it clearly, even over the engine. Then it leaned in close to the tree and exhaled. The sound rolled across the clearing, low and wet, vibrating through the night air in a way that made my teeth ache. It wasn't directed at me anymore. It was aimed at the forest itself, like a signal or an answer. Something moved deeper in the woods. Branches shifted. Leaves rustled in a pattern that wasn't wind-driven, too localized, too intentional. I caught flashes of movement beyond the tree line, nothing solid, nothing I could describe, but enough to tell me that the thing beside my RV hadn't been alone. Panic finally won. I slammed the gear into drive and hit the accelerator, gravel spraying as the Rialta lurched forward. The headlights bounced wildly as I tore down the loop road, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear loose from my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I didn't care if I clipped a tree or sideswiped another rig. All I knew was that staying meant something bad, something irreversible. The road twisted downhill, narrow and unforgiving, bordered by trees that leaned in close like they were trying to reclaim it. My hands shook on the wheel, sweat slicking the vinyl. Every shadow felt like movement. Every reflective marker looked like a pair of eyes. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I pulled over onto the shoulder, hazards flashing, engine still running, chest heaving as I fought to get air back into my lungs. The smell followed me, not as strong as before, but present, clinging to the upholstery, the vents, my clothes. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the empty pavement, waiting for my heart to slow, waiting for the world to make sense again. Eventually, rational thought crept back in, shaky and assumed rather than trusted. Adrenaline, sleep deprivation, a misidentified animal, a trick of light. I ran through the explanations like a checklist, forcing each one to stand in for what I'd seen. None of them fit. I drove the rest of the night, not stopping until dawn smeared pale light across the mountains. I pulled into a busy rest area off I-81, surrounded by semis and commuters and the comforting noise of humanity. Only then did I shut off the engine. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me hard, sharp and clean. The smell was gone. The world looked ordinary again, too ordinary, almost insulting in its normalcy. I stood there, hands on my knees, breathing deeply, grounding myself in the mundane details. The hiss of air brakes, the smell of diesel, the chatter of voices. I didn't go back to Loft Mountain. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because saying it out loud felt like giving it more shape, more reality, like calling it back into the world. In the months that followed, I replayed the night over and over, not searching for monsters, but for my own mistakes. I realized how easily I'd dismissed my instincts, how quickly I'd rationalized discomfort instead of respecting it. I'd gone looking for solitude without considering what solitude can invite. Campgrounds, especially the quiet ones, sit on edges, between safety and wilderness, between control and surrender. We like to believe the lines are clear, that posted signs and numbered sites hold back everything wild. But the truth is messier. Now, when I camp, I pay attention in a way I didn't before. I listen not just for noise, but for patterns. I trust the unease that rises without explanation. I don't stay where the night feels too heavy, where the silence presses instead of opens. Some people chase fear for the thrill of it. I'm not one of them. I learned that night that fear can be a form of intelligence, a quiet warning that doesn't shout until it's ignored too many times. Whatever stood beside my RV at Shenandoah didn't need to chase me. It didn't need to force its way inside. It only needed me to understand that I wasn't as alone or as protected as I thought. And sometimes that knowledge is more haunting than anything that follows you into the dark. The strange thing was how the fear didn't leave when the sun came up. It just changed shape. For weeks after that night, I slept lightly, even at home, even with walls thick enough to muffle the outside world. Every unfamiliar sound pulled me halfway out of sleep, heart already racing before my mind could catch up. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for breathing that wasn't mine, convinced for a few terrible seconds that something had followed me back without needing to move at all. What bothered me most wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt while it was happening. There was a moment, back there at Loft Mountain, when fear wasn't the loudest thing in my body. It was certainty. A calm, chilling understanding that whatever stood beside my RV wasn't lost, wasn't confused, and wasn't acting on instinct alone. It behaved like it understood boundaries and how to cross them without force. That realization stayed with me. I stopped camping for a while after that, sold the idea to myself as a break, a reset. Truth was, I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. I kept replaying the small decisions that led me there, choosing an off-season site, dismissing the smell, ignoring the first brush against the wall. Each choice seemed harmless on its own. Together, they built a situation I couldn't undo. When I finally took the RV out again, it was months later in a crowded state park closer to home. Families everywhere, generators humming, laughter drifting through the trees. I told myself this was safer, controlled. Still, that first night, I caught myself checking the locks 3 times, sleeping with the lights off but the key in the ignition, listening not just to what I could hear but to what I couldn't. Because silence, I learned, isn't empty, it's observant. I started paying attention to things I used to ignore, how the woods sometimes go quiet all at once, like someone flipped a switch, how animals avoid certain stretches of land without obvious reason, how smells can change without wind, creeping in low and heavy, bypassing logic and heading straight for the nervous system. I read more, talked quietly to other longtime campers, phrasing my questions carefully, never describing my experience outright. I didn't need confirmation, I just needed context. A few people hesitated before answering. That hesitation told me more than words ever could. One older man, camped near me in West Virginia the following spring, told me something I still think about. He said there are places where the wilderness doesn't want witnesses and places where it doesn't want company. Most of the time, you can't tell which is which until you've stayed too long. He never elaborated. Didn't need to. October returned a year later, and with it the same restless urge that had pulled me to Shenandoah in the first place. I thought about Loft Mountain more than I wanted to admit, not with curiosity, but with a kind of reluctant respect, like remembering the site of an accident you survived, knowing exactly how close the margin was. I never went back, not because I was afraid of what I might see again, but because I was afraid of what might see me. The memory of that breathing stayed vivid, not just the sound, but the intimacy of it, how close it was, how personal. Breathing is something we associate with life, with presence, with vulnerability. To hear it from the other side of a thin wall, in the dark, without invitation, that crosses something deep and ancient inside the human mind. That night taught me something I didn't want to learn, that not all threats announce themselves with violence. Some just wait, patient and observant, until you make the mistake of believing you're alone. I still camp. I still love the road, the quiet mornings, the way fog lifts slowly off the hills like the land itself is waking up. But I don't chase isolation anymore. I don't confuse solitude with safety, and I never ignore the moment when my body knows something my mind hasn't caught up to yet. If the air feels wrong, I leave. If the silence presses, I don't stay to prove anything. If something brushes the wall, I don't rationalize. I respond. Because the wilderness doesn't need permission to remind you where you stand. And sometimes in places like Shenandoah, it doesn't roar or rush or reveal itself fully. Sometimes it just breathes beside you in the dark, close enough for you to feel it through the walls you thought would protect you. Close enough to teach you that survival isn't about bravery. It's about listening and knowing when to go. The first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was the sudden, irrational certainty that if I stopped moving, something in the dark would notice me. I'm not proud of how long it took that thought to form, because by the time it did, my hands were already tight on the steering wheel, knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard, the old Volkswagen humming beneath me like it was trying to warn me in its own tired language. My name is Caleb Hartman. I was 39 that summer, a Colorado local who'd spent most of his adult life pretending solitude was a kind of strength. I'd driven my faded white VW Westphalia down toward Moab alone in early July of 2023, chasing quiet, chasing distance, chasing the version of myself that only ever showed up when there was nothing around me but red rock and sky. I told people I camped to clear my head. That wasn't the whole truth. I camped because the noise of everyday life made it too easy to ignore the instincts that whispered when things weren't right. Out there, in places where the land still felt older than language, those instincts had nowhere to hide. The heat that day had been brutal, the kind that seeps into your bones even after sunset. By the time I turned off the main road and followed a cracked ribbon of asphalt toward a dispersed camping area northeast of town, the sky had gone that deep desert blue that feels less like nightfall and more like a held breath. No cell service, no traffic. Just the road stretching ahead, narrow and uneven, flanked by scrub brush and stone that seemed to lean inward as if listening. I remember noticing the smell first, dust and hot rubber and something faintly metallic that didn't belong to either. I told myself it was nothing. Old road, old van, old imagination. I'd driven that stretch once before, years earlier, with friends. Back then it had felt wide, open, forgiving. Alone, it felt different. The headlights carved two pale tunnels through the dark, and everything beyond them might as well have not existed. The radio crackled uselessly, catching fragments of static that rose and fell like distant breathing. I shut it off and let the silence press in. That was when I saw her. At first, she looked like a trick of light, something the heat had left behind my vision. A pale shape, motionless, standing dead center in my lane. I eased off the gas without realizing I'd done it, my foot hovering as my mind tried to make sense of what my eyes were telling me. As I rolled closer, the shape resolved into a woman. She was barefoot. That detail landed with a strange weight, heavier than it should have. No shoes, no bag, no phone glowing in her hand. She stood with her arms at her sides, head slightly bowed, hair hanging forward in a way that hid her face. The road out there wasn't a place people walked at night, especially not alone, especially not without shoes. My headlights washed over her legs, pale and dusty, and the asphalt beneath her feet looked rough enough to tear skin. I slowed to a crawl, my heart beginning to thud in my ears. Every instinct I had told me to keep going, to pass her without stopping, to not break the fragile barrier of motion that separated me from whatever this was. But another voice, quieter, older, more insidious, whispered that you don't leave someone stranded in the desert. That whatever fear I felt was selfish, exaggerated, unworthy. I cracked the window instead of opening the door. The night air rushed in, carrying the smell of sage and stone and that same metallic note. "Hey," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" She didn't move. The silence stretched. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast, and beneath it the soft ticking of the engine cooling as I slowed further. My headlights made her cast a long, distorted shadow behind her, and something about that shadow felt wrong. Too still, too sharp. "I can help," I said, the words automatic, rehearsed by a lifetime of social expectation. "Do you need a ride?" Her head lifted then, just enough for me to see her face. I wish I could tell you it was obviously threatening, that there was something clearly wrong I could point to now as justification. But the truth is worse. Her face was ordinary, early 30s maybe. Dirt smudged along her cheek, eyes dark, reflective, catching the light like an animal's. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to speak. And then she smiled. It was small, controlled, not relief, not gratitude. It didn't reach her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice soft but carrying easily through the open window. "My car broke down. I've been walking for hours." The words were normal. The delivery wasn't. There was no strain in her voice, no dryness, no urgency, just calm, as if she'd been expecting me. I glanced past her, down the empty road ahead and behind. No hazard lights. No silhouettes of a vehicle pulled off to the side. Just darkness swallowing everything beyond the reach of my beams. My chest tightened. "Where's your car?" I asked. She turned her head slowly, gesturing vaguely back the way I'd come. "Not far." Another lie. I knew it the moment she said it. The desert at night doesn't let you forget distance. Hours of walking leave marks. On your skin, in your posture, in the way you breathe. She looked untouched. I told myself I was being paranoid. That true crime podcasts and campfire stories had rewired my brain. That fear thrives on isolation, and I'd given it plenty. Still, I didn't unlock the door. "I can call someone for you," I said, even though I knew there was no signal. "Or I can drive ahead and get help." Her smile faded, just a little. Enough that I noticed. "No," she said. "I need to come with you." The certainty in her tone made my stomach drop. She took a step closer, her bare foot slapping softly against the pavement. I saw then that her soles were unmarked, no cuts, no blood, no grit embedded in skin. Another step, and she was close enough that I could see the whites of her eyes clearly, unblinking. A memory surfaced then, uninvited. My father's voice, low and firm from years ago on a hunting trip. If something feels off out here, you listen. Politeness gets people killed. I swallowed. I can't, I said. I'm sorry. For a heartbeat, she just stared at me. Then her expression shifted, not to anger, not to sadness, but to something colder. Calculating. She took another step, close enough now that my headlights cast her shadow across the hood of the van. You don't want to do that, she said quietly. The words sent a pulse of panic through me, so sharp it was almost pain. My foot slammed the accelerator before my brain caught up. The engine roared, the van lurched forward, and for a split second I thought I was going to hit her. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there as I swerved around her, tires spitting gravel as I surged past. In the rearview mirror, I saw her turn slowly, tracking me with her gaze, her figure shrinking as the road curved and the darkness swallowed her whole. I didn't slow down for miles. My heart hammered, sweat slicked my back despite the night air, and my hands shook so badly I had to force them to stay on the wheel. I kept telling myself it was over, that I'd done the right thing, that she was just a person, just a strange moment amplified by isolation and fear. But the desert has a way of holding on to things. When I finally pulled into a small clearing to camp, far sooner than I'd planned, the silence felt different, thicker, expectant. As I shut off the engine, the sudden absence of sound rang in my ears. I sat there in the dark, listening, replaying her voice, her smile, the way she'd said, "You don't want to do that," like a promise instead of a warning. And somewhere beyond the reach of my headlights, the night seemed to listen back. I stayed in the driver's seat longer than I meant to, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, counting the seconds between sounds until I realized I was doing it just to prove I was still in control of time. The clearing was nothing special. Flat ground scraped raw by tires, a ring of old firestones, juniper pressing in from all sides like a crowd pretending not to stare. I'd parked so the van faced outward, a habit I'd picked up years ago without ever admitting why. Easier to leave that way, easier to run. When I finally stepped out, the heat hit me again, trapped close to the earth. My boots crunched softly on gravel, and that sound felt too loud, like I was announcing myself to something that already knew where I was. I did a slow circle with my flashlight, its beam catching moths and dust in the pale trunks of scrub trees. Nothing moved. No voices. No footsteps. Just the low chorus of insects and, far off, the hollow call of something nocturnal that echoed once and then fell silent. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I'd imagined the threat in her voice because fear likes to dress itself up as intuition. I went through the motions, unlatched the pop top, set up the small propane stove, laid out my sleeping bag, but my hands kept trembling, and I kept pausing, head cocked, listening for a sound that never quite came. The smell was back, stronger now that the engine was off. That faint metallic tang like old pennies or blood dried too long in the sun. I sniffed my shirt, the air, the ground. Nothing obvious. The desert gives nothing away easily. I ate cold food I barely tasted and forced myself to sit outside for a while, staring up at the stars. They were brilliant, scattered thick across the sky, indifferent to whatever fear curled in my chest. Usually that sight grounded me. That night, it made me feel smaller than I ever had, like I'd wandered into a place where human rules didn't apply. I kept thinking about her feet, clean, unmarked, standing on that road like it belonged to her. When I finally crawled into the van and zipped the door shut, the fabric sounded thin, inadequate. I lay on my back, eyes open, tracing the shadows cast by moonlight through the canvas above. Every rustle of wind made my muscles tense. Every creak of the van settling sounded like a footstep. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly like someone who knew exactly how loud they needed to be. My eyes flew open, heart slamming so hard I felt dizzy. For a moment I lay frozen, convinced I was still dreaming. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Not on the door, on the side panel, near where my head rested, close enough that I could feel the vibration through the thin wall. Every rational thought scattered. My mind filled the silence with images, her smile, her eyes in the headlights, the way she'd stood her ground as I swerved past. I held my breath, listening. The insects outside had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting. "Hello?" came a voice, barely above a whisper. It was hers. My throat closed. There was no way she could have followed me on foot. I'd driven fast. I'd turned off twice. I knew that road network. You couldn't shortcut it without a vehicle. And yet there she was, close enough to touch my van. "I know you're in there," she said gently. "You left me." The accusation wasn't angry. It was wounded. Intimate. Like we shared something now. I reached for my phone with shaking fingers, the screen lighting the cramped space with a cold glow. No signal. Of course. I checked the time. 2:17 a.m. I don't know why that mattered, only that it anchored the moment in something concrete. "Please," she said, her knuckles brushing the metal again, lighter this time, almost affectionate. "It's cold." It wasn't. The night was still warm, the air heavy. The lie landed wrong, scraping against my nerves. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to disappear, trying to make myself smaller than the fear. Another knock, harder now. The van shuddered slightly. Something shifted then. Not outside, but inside me. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Years ago, ignoring a gut feeling in a different place, a different context, and paying for it with months of regret. I'd promised myself after that I would listen next time, that I would trust the quiet voice instead of the loud excuses. I sat up slowly, every movement deliberate. I grabbed the keys from the hook by the door, the metal cold against my palm. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. No voice. No sound of footsteps retreating, just the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Then she laughed. It was soft, almost musical, and it came from right outside the door. "You're scared," she said. "You should be." That did it. Panic surged, hot and uncontrollable. I shoved my feet into my boots, flung open the door, and climbed into the driver's seat in one clumsy motion. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't look anywhere but straight ahead as I turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice. My heart stuttered with it. "Come on," I hissed, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, loud in the stillness. Relief flooded me so fast it made my hands numb. As I threw the van into gear, movement flashed in my peripheral vision. A shape crossing in front of the headlights. I slammed the brakes, the van lurching to a stop so hard my chest hit the wheel. She stood there again, barefoot, smiling. Up close, in the harsh white light, I saw details I hadn't before. The dirt on her skin wasn't smeared randomly. It was too even, too deliberate, like makeup. Her eyes reflected the light wrong, flat and glassy. And her smile, it was wider now, stretching just a little too far. "You could have just helped me," she said, placing her hand on the hood. Her fingers splayed, nails clean, unbroken. "Now you've made this difficult." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body moved on instinct alone. I cranked the wheel and gunned the engine, gravel spraying as I swerved around her again. This time she stepped aside easily, almost lazily, like she'd known exactly where I'd go. I didn't stop. I didn't camp again that night. I drove until the horizon began to pale and the world slowly reclaimed its colors. Only then did I pull over, hands still shaking, heart still racing. The image of her burned into my mind. In the daylight, everything looked ordinary, harmless, the road empty, the desert vast and indifferent. I half convinced myself it had all been some elaborate nightmare fueled by isolation and fear. But as I stepped out to stretch my legs, I noticed something on the hood of the van. 5 dusty fingerprints, perfectly spaced, barely visible unless you knew to look. And in that moment, standing alone on an empty road near Moab, I understood something I'd spent years avoiding, that the wilderness doesn't just test your survival skills. It tests whether you're willing to trust yourself when the cost of being wrong feels too high. Somewhere out there, I was certain of it. She was still standing in the road, waiting for the next set of headlights to slow. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those fingerprints like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense if I just waited long enough. The sun was up now, bleaching the desert into familiar colors. Rust-red rock, pale sand, scrubby green clinging stubbornly to life. Morning birds flitted between bushes, their calls sharp and ordinary. Everything was telling me I was safe. My body didn't believe it. I wiped the hood with my sleeve. The dust smeared, but the prints didn't vanish right away. They faded slowly, reluctantly, like they didn't want to let go. That scared me more than if they'd been gone entirely. Proof meant I hadn't imagined it. Proof meant I hadn't just panicked at a harmless stranger in the dark. I drove into Moab on autopilot, parked near a gas station, and sat there watching people go about their mornings. Coffee cups in hand, bikes strapped to cars, conversations about trails and weather. I must have looked normal enough because no one paid me any attention. I wanted to tell someone, anyone. But the story sounded thin even in my own head. A barefoot woman, a voice in the night, knocking, smiling. I filled up the tank and asked the clerk, as casually as I could manage, if anyone had reported a broken-down car on the road northeast of town overnight. He shook his head without thinking about it. Not that I heard. You'd be surprised how many folks think they see things out there. Think they see things. I nodded, thanked him, and left without buying anything. I didn't camp again on that trip. I pointed the van north and drove for hours, putting distance between me and that stretch of road, between me and the version of myself who'd almost unlocked the door. The farther I got, the more the fear settled into something colder, heavier. Not panic anymore, understanding. For years, I'd treated RV camping like an escape hatch, a way to outrun responsibilities, memories, instincts I didn't want to sit with. Out there alone, I told myself I was free. But the desert had a way of stripping that lie down to its bones. Freedom without awareness is just exposure. Solitude without trust in yourself is an invitation. I replayed every moment in my head over and over, looking for the exact point where things could have gone differently. If I'd stopped, if I'd opened the door, if I'd convinced myself one more time that politeness mattered more than intuition. The images didn't feel hypothetical. They felt close, parallel, like another version of that night had unfolded just out of sight. When I finally crossed back into Colorado, the landscape softened. Trees thickened, the air cooled. I pulled into a familiar campground late in the afternoon when I'd stayed at dozens of times before and set up without incident. That night, I slept, but not deeply. Dreams came and went, restless and fragmented, filled with roads that never ended and figures that stood motionless no matter how fast I drove. In the weeks that followed, I did something I'd never done before. I researched. Quietly. Late at night. I found forum posts, local news blurbs, half-finished threads where people talked about encounters near Moab, drivers reporting a woman in the road, barefoot, asking for help. Some stories ended with people giving her a ride and then nothing. The posts just stopped. Others mentioned knocking at campsites, laughter in the dark, unexplained marks on vehicles, no conclusions, no answers, just patterns. I stopped camping alone for a while after that. When I did go back out, I planned differently, parked smarter, trusted the first flicker of unease instead of arguing with it. I learned that fear isn't always something to conquer. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes it's the oldest, most reliable signal you have. I still drive that Volkswagen. It's older now, like me, full of noises and quirks you learn to listen to if you want it to keep going. Every so often on a long stretch of empty road, I'll catch sight of something pale at the edge of my headlights, a post, a sign, a trick of shadow, and my heart will jump before I can stop it. I don't slow down anymore. Because the lesson that night near Moab burned into me wasn't about monsters or ghosts or whatever name makes the story easier to swallow. It was about thresholds, about the moments when the world asks you, quietly, who you're willing to risk yourself for, and whether you trust yourself enough to walk away when something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why. The desert didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It just showed me how thin the line is between safety and surrender, between help and harm, between listening and being lost. And somewhere out there on a road that looks just like 100 others, I believe she's still standing barefoot on the asphalt, waiting for someone who mistakes silence for safety and kindness for obligation. If you ever see her, don't stop. Trust the voice that tells you to keep going. It might be the only thing that gets you home.